Well, actually, I was thinking about your analogy of buying a Ferrari, and I was thinking about it before. It's a little bit different because they've basically cut their revenue stream by giving back money to like to cut the taxes they would usually get from landlords and from people, right? So they've cut
Yeah.
their revenue. So it would be actually more like you've reduced your hours at work for whatever reason, and then you've gone, oh, I don't have enough money, so I'm going to borrow it instead. Is that kind of a better analogy, Craig?
Well, certainly the Crown's reduced its revenue. Now, it's fair to say um, the cuts in the revenue only start in April this year,
Mm-hmm.
because that's when tax cuts started to bleed through. And so actually only a small part of the tax cuts have actually come through in this set of accounts. The next set of accounts, the next year's accounts, will show the really big falls in revenue as a consequence of the tax cuts. What this also shows is that some of the revenue we thought was going to turn up hasn't turned up, and that's because the economy isn't doing so well. So
Right.
corporate tax fell 5%. We spent 17% more this year on unemployment benefits than we did last year. We spent 8% overall on more benefits than we did last year. So we're seeing the impacts of that slowdown in the economy. We're seeing the impacts of fewer people spending any money. GST receipts rose 4.1%. Great. But actually, that's less than the inflation during the majority of that period of time. So again, it suggests that there's a really slow economy, things aren't going so well. And the reason those things are important is because the accounts are telling us there's no engine of growth. The government isn't investing. We see net investment fall every year for the forecast period in the government's accounts. The private sector isn't investing, it's not growing. We're seeing unemployment rise. So consumers aren't going to be investing. So where is this magic growth going to come from, which will create the tax, which will create the revenue that we need to deliver the public services? We can't keep cutting our way to try and find, you end up in this vicious spiral of cut, things get worse, so you cut, so things get worse, so you cut.
Yeah.
Instead, you actually need to do what has been textbook economics for 70, 80 years, which is when the economy is in a state, when things aren't going so well, the Crown intervenes because it's got much deeper pockets to reduce the impacts of that fall, to make sure people stay in work so that when the recovery does turn up, you get a much better recovery rather than much deeper scarring that occurs if you leave it alone. And that's been the experience in the country that I'm from, the UK, where post the GFC, we did exactly that. We went for austerity, we cut public services left, right, and centre, and it took a decade to get out of that mistake. I don't want to see us repeat that mistake here. We really need to change our approach to how we're dealing with the current crisis, which on a GDP per capita basis is actually worse than the GFC rate.
Hmm.
Nicola Willis said in that conversation, quote, what the books today tell us, end quote. I'm interested because what they're doing a little bit is going, oh my God, have you seen the books? They're so bad. But they had pre-fu, then they had a budget, and now the books are opened again. Are they really, is this now a little bit like they're going to go, maybe this will be the last time we can say blame Labor because the next budget's all us? Because it feels like, they've written out all these checks all year, and then they've flipped back through the stubs on their old checkbook. I'm a very old person, people watching, and going, oh my God, look how much I've spent. Like they seem surprised, but shouldn't they pretty much know what the books are going to tell them today?
Well, we have fantastically open books in New Zealand. We're amongst the best place in the world in terms of the transparency of our public accounts. Again, if this was the UK, we could only dream of the level of transparency and that New Zealand has. Huge, overwhelming volumes of information about public expenditure. So none of this should be a surprise. And interestingly, if we go back to the accounts that were forecast in September last year, just before the election, the result that we have now is pretty much the result that was forecast in September.
Right.
So despite all the claims of cutting back, being more sensible, and managing prudently, books are what they were predicted to be before we even had a change in government. So there doesn't seem to have been a huge amount of change what's going on. I just want to tell you one thing, Pat, just to give you just slightly depress you. You know,
Oh, thanks.
That's why I'm economist. I was born in 1979 in the UK, and the first election I could vote in was 1997. That saw Tony Blair being elected. That entire 18-year period was under a Conservative government.
Mm-hmm.
6 months before the election to have elected Tony Blair, the Conservative government was still blaming the Labour government of 1979 for the progress at that point. So I don't think any government's ever going to turn around and not use the previous government as an excuse for what it needs to do.